the great hall of the Justice League, there are assembled the world's 4 greatest heroes, created from the cosmic legends of the universe. Superman.
I've got a feeling that Aquaman and Batman and Robin might need our help.
Wonder Woman.
See you back in the Hall of Justice League.
Batman.
Obviously, then, Professor Baffles only baffles where almonds linger in the air.
Aquaman.
All right, we know where the money went. Now what we want to do is find Professor Baffles.
And those 3 junior super friends, Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog.
Don't try anything foolish, Marvin.
Their mission, to fight injustice, to right that which is wrong, and to serve all mankind.
Welcome back, everyone, to an all-new episode of the World's Greatest Super Friends podcast. You know, I still don't even have a cute little catch thing yet to say, it's so-and-so here. But my name is John S. Drew, and I am joined in these reviews by the man himself from 13thdimension.com, Mr. Dan Greenfield. Hey, Dan.
Hey, John. Well, see, there you have it, the man himself. You've got that. So, you know, that's kind of shtick, I guess.
Well, but I always usually say, it's your old bat chum, or it's the director of the OSI files, or your mentor, as I say on Shazam ISIS. But I don't have anything. I don't want to say I'm your Superman. That would be weird.
You can say the trouble alert is sounding, and here we are with,
Okay.
Anyway.
There you
All
go.
Right. That's terrible.
Now watch how I use it next time.
Right.
So this time around, we're taking on the second episode of the Super Friends cartoon series, the first season from 1973, The Baffles Puzzle. And I gotta say right from the start, I like this one better.
Yeah, I mean, look, I this is such a weird thing and again, admittedly, because when we talked about doing this, I did say, I remember even saying to you at the time, like, I don't love the first season of the Super Friends, so it's kind of a weird thing to do for a podcast for me, because I want to do it because it's such a seminal cartoon series for comic book fans and animation fans. At the same time, some of these episodes are hard to watch, but I did find the solution. And I found that the solution to watching these early episodes and enjoying them more is fast-forwarding through the Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog scenes.
Yes.
And this is, and I mean this scenes not that when they're with the heroes themselves, but I'm talking about these extended segments where it's just the 3 of them. Mm-hmm. Because you can really follow the plot without having to watch some of the hijinks between these characters. And I don't mean to sound like a jerk or anything. It's just that and as I've gone on record before, is that the biggest and best change, or one of the biggest and best changes that the producers made after this first season, was getting rid of those characters, because they're just basically off-brand versions of Shaggy, Daphne, and Scooby. They're not as charming, they're not as funny, they're just kind of annoying and in the way. But yeah, I agree. This was kind of a little bit more. The storytelling was a little bit more assured than the first one. It felt a little less padded, and there were actually some kind of interesting animation bits in this episode too.
Yes, there were. I noticed that myself. But here's the thing: you mentioned fast-forwarding through those scenes. This episode strongly shows how useless they really are as characters, and how certain story elements didn't get picked up on in favor of having Wendy and Marvin and Wonder Dog do this shtick, which really annoyed me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing about them, and again, this is not going to be a whole episode where we're knocking them, but I still, this is one of those areas where the people, it wasn't first generation animation or anything, but it was still kind of part of the first generation of TV animation. And the way animators and producers approach their work now versus how they approached it back then, there's always that sense of the audience being talked down to as opposed to be talking to. And by having these characters, they're talking to young children and assuming that young kids would need to have characters like this somehow to relate to Batman, Robin, Aquaman, Wonder Woman, and Superman, which just by saying that sentence sounds so absurd. Because those are the characters that all kids were reading. Kids were reading those characters in comics going back to the 30s. And I get that the idea of having a teenage sidekick or a youthful sidekick was like a point of view, Robin being created for Batman, and then, of course, all the whole golden age wave of teenage sidekicks. But when you already have Robin on the team, you kind of don't need junior sidekicks. So, but I do like the solution that they came up with in later episodes of Zan and Jaina, because at least, even though there were some annoying factors there, at least they had style, and at least they had superpowers and something that made them a little bit different and gave them a little bit of pizzazz. These guys, as long as they're on the screen, I actually start getting annoyed.
There's actually a point in the episode where they try, Wendy and Marvin, to tell Robin something, and even Robin dismisses them.
Obviously, we are dealing with a most inventive criminal mind.
Robin, at the museum, Wonder Dog was...
The less said about Wonder Dog at the museum, the better for everybody, especially Wonder Dog. But he smelled almonds there and at the library. We'll talk about it a little later, kids. Right now, we better listen to this.
Yeah. He calls them kids.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, maybe you're a little older, you're the same age.
Yeah, I know. That's the other thing. Well, they make Robin bigger, too. So
yes,
you get the sense that maybe Robin is 18 or 19 years old in this version, and Wonder Marvin or Super Marvin and Wendy are maybe 14 and 15. Does that sound about right?
That's a possibility. Yeah.
Yep.
It's weird because those kind of things, and again, we're looking at an over 40-year-old show as a pair of 50-year-old men doing this, but
right, exactly. That's fair. That's the other thing is that we it's true. I don't want. Yeah, exactly. Let's not be unfair. So anyway, let's talk about the things we like.
Yeah, but you know me. I'm always about trying to find the stories in between and connecting the dots and creating continuity that was never meant to be created for shows back then. That's me. I was that way with Batman. I'm that way with Six Mil and all the others.
Sure, that's true.
So really quick synopsis here. At first it seems like a job for the police as encyclopedias disappear from the library, but when rare artworks do as well, it's clear this is a job for the Super Friends, especially when, and this is something else also, we only get this for the first season, they're contacted by Colonel Wilcox, and this is his first episode. He heads up the Secret Department of Investigation.
We're getting a CDQ from the SDI.
CDQ from the SDI?
A high-priority communication from the Secret Department of Investigation.
The Secret Department of Investigation?
I just said that, Marvin.
But the idea that there's this organization that they answer to or at least liaise with.
Right.
But I also do like the opening scene. A couple things. The idea of the the Justice League, because they are called the Justice League.
Yes.
Sitting around being bored at the Hall of Justice is hysterical. Because they've had their meeting, and I guess there's just not enough going on. So Superman's just sitting there reading a book, and it looks like Wonder Woman's just kind of channel surfing with the trouble alert. She's just hanging out, looking at stuff. I'm not sure. I don't remember what Aquaman's doing, but Batman and Robin are shooting pool in full costume, and I love that. And Batman's break, of course, he breaks, and all of the balls go in their pockets, including the cue ball. I mean everything. And Robin's like, wow, nice break, Batman. And Batman's like, well, what do you want? There are only 15 balls on the car. I mean, it was just this total throwaway gag that is completely weird when you think about it in its own way, that the idea of Batman and Robin shooting pool. But that's what I love about that's the fun stuff of these cartoons, because it's those little bits of silver aginess that were creeping into, still into the 70s. The idea, because at the time, the comics were, Batman by 1973 was back to his kind of dark roots. You had Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil and all these other writers and artists were looking at them, as like this kind of serious, more gothic kind of, not a horror book exactly, but, meanwhile on TV, Batman and Robin were still looked at sort of as an outgrowth of the Batman 66 TV show. So you had this kind of light version of them. But even then, the idea of them sitting around playing pool or standing around playing pool is kind of funny.
they're an outgrowth of the 66 show. Yeah, in fact, there's a scene in the episode where the duo almost get run over by a car and Robin falls in the grass and Batman chastises him.
Robin, that sign says keep off the grass.
Careless of me, Batman.
I'm sorry. Was anybody hurt?
Not this time, but unless you slow down, somebody may be hurt.
I promise, Batman, I won't ever speed again.
And yet, despite that, there's also then, because again, this being the Super Friends, the way they were doing it, it's let's go search. You take the air, Wonder Woman. You take the water, and we take to the streets. And they don't even go in the Batmobile. They're walking the streets, looking to make sure everything's all right.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's little touches of everything here, if you think about it. I mean, not that it was that dark. They're just walking down the street, but still, just something about it just said, okay, this is a bit more, the modern Batman.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
I also thought, because you talked about animation choices, that every establishing shot, whether it's the Hall of Justice, the library, the museum, seemed almost painted rather than animated.
Yeah, we saw that a lot in Filmation, but you do see that here as well. Yeah, it's the one thing about as far as the animation in this episode. I mean, these earlier episodes they're even more. I think the animation is even cruder in these earlier episodes than we saw as the series went on. Particularly when you later on when you saw what was going on with with the Legion of Doom and what have you. I mean, the Hanna-Barbera they did things on the cheap. Not as cheap as Filmation did, but they did things on the cheap. But you do still see those moments of, those flares. Because remember, the people who were working on these shows, these were still professionals. Mm-hmm. I mean, the designer of the series, as we've said, or the designer of the characters, Alex Toth, was one of the all-time greats. You did see, there was a lot of greatness surrounding these, but the pressure of doing things on, in a kind of a limited way as far as the animation and some of the writing, it just wasn't. It's not as crisp as you would. I guess in a way, the sum is less than the show is less than the sum of its parts in a weird way, if that makes any sense. But yeah, some of the matte paintings are pretty good in this one. But there's one scene that I really did like with the animation is there's a shot of Superman, and it's from above Superman's head, and the way he just kind of flies across the screen. And you see his cape go by. And I'm like, that's a really interesting choice that they made in terms of trying to show things a little differently rather than repeating the same stock images over the time, which you would see on Filmation all the time, where you would see Superman flying the same way all the time, and you'd see Batman and Robin punching or swinging the same way all the time. At least there's some different pieces here when you're watching the show.
Right. There were some weird choices. There were some obvious flubs. There's one point there where Batman's logo, as we see from time to time throughout the series and with Filmation, but is completely gone. But it's not even like a momentary gap. It's through the length of the whole scene, Batman is not showing the logo at all. It's just the bare chest. There's the thing with the woman when she runs over Batman and Robin, and then she's kind of leaning over to the passenger side window to talk to them. She herself is more centered, and for some reason they moved her wheel to the center as well, so she could have her hand on the wheel instead of just leaving it to the side. I don't know. It was strange. And then there's one scene of Superman flying overhead of two of the goons' cars, or two of the goons in their car. The goons are all animated, but Superman himself is not. It's an interesting shot, but it's just weird not to see him moving as he flies. It's just a still. It's almost like he's frozen in above them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just some interesting choices there in the animation. But overall, I also do think the animation is better in this episode than in the last one. And from what I understand, the first season was farmed out to 3 different companies.
Well, that would account for it, wouldn't it? Yes, I agree with you that this was definitely a smoother episode than the first one. There were some really strange animation, I don't know what to call them, choices. I don't know what to call them. But some of the animation in the first episode was really, really rough, especially the opening scene. where characters' arms are really like kind of awkwardly placed, and it just really seems, really shoddy. You don't really see that in this episode. I agree. Right. What did you think of the villain?
See, this was interesting because this time you've got another misguided villain like in the last episode, but he's misguided by two actual villains.
Right. He's a dupe as opposed to, the classic Star Wars idea of here's a villain doing something out of self-interest, not realizing the harm that they're causing.
Right. The thing is, though, after everything, he still hasn't learned his lesson because by the end of it, there's Baffles with the Super Friends and saying,
I still feel that man has made the world a terrible place to live. There may be a lot of things wrong with the world, but there are a lot of wonderful things in it, too.
And no one man can make the decision on how to change things.
I still think humanity's messed up, which is a really dark idea to sell to kids.
I remember the time that these cartoons were being made, and nothing happens in a vacuum. And it was a very, very cynical time. Mm-hmm. And kids do pick things up. They do pick up things by osmosis. You know as a parent, and I know as a parent, that your kids start asking you questions about things earlier than you think they're going to. And you say to yourself, so where did that come from? Where did you pick that up? And now, of course, it's even more so with kids, their access to the internet and what have you. But back then, this was during Vietnam. This was during the energy crisis. This was during, this was the first real period where the environment was really becoming an issue. As I think I mentioned it in the last episode, where we used to call it the ecology, and that was a big, the whole "Don't Litter" campaigns and the Make America Beautiful and all of those campaigns that were going on in the early 70s. Plus, like I said, the energy crisis. Plus Watergate, and you have all of these things kind of swirling about, and it was kind of a cynical time. So these episodes, there is the one thing that the Super Friends, I don't want to keep comparing Super Friends to Filmation, but it's a natural comparison, especially since you and I have spent so much time going over Batman, Batman and Robin in Filmation, is these episodes did take on quote-unquote real-world issues straight on in ways that Filmation did not. Filmation really were about the plots in and of themselves, although they would have these sly references to things. Or they had they had the election episode, which was a great satire in and of itself, but it only worked in that as a satire if you were an adult watching it. If you were a kid, it was kind of a straightforward caper. But here, they do deal with things, like in the first episode was about the environment. And in a sense, they dealt with these issues head on and made them the plot. Does that make any sense to you?
No, it does.
Yeah.
No, it does. Absolutely. And I had to wonder as I'm looking at this, because the end idea being no one man can decide how to change things, and I'm like going, right. I can think of some people today who need to watch this episode.
Yes. Yes, that's true. Yeah, I thought of that also.
There were a lot of little things that I did like, the little touches, like the fact that we get to see Clark Kent in this episode.
Again, as I've said about Super Friends, is that for me, whether it's reading comics or watching TV shows or movies or whatever it is, if you don't have the balance between the secret identity and the heroic character, I think you're missing something. Because there's something transformative that you enjoy. It's what was one of the most exciting things of watching Batman 66 was the transformation of Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson to Batman and Robin. Them doing their Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson shtick, whatever it was they were doing at Wayne Manor or wherever they were, and then having to get called and then having to, boom, now we have to go to become Batman and Robin, and how exciting that was. And when occasionally they would be able to throw in their secret identities as part of the plot, and maybe it would be, they'd mix it up by having Batman having to team up with Dick Grayson or Bruce Wayne having to team up with Robin and Batgirl. And I always really, really enjoyed that. And they didn't do that much on Super Friends. Mostly, and this is throughout the entire run. Mostly, it was just Batman was Batman, Robin was Robin, Superman was Superman, and so on. Here, yes, you get to see Clark, and it's not just like a quick throwaway. It's for a pretty extended scene where it's Superman as Clark Kent, and Clark Kent is actually getting the job done. And I appreciated that too.
There is, and I will, stand by it. I think I even put it down as one of my favorites for your top 13 Batman stories in all media is the Super Friends episode, The Fear.
Right.
Where we see Bruce, we see Dick, we see Alfred, for God's sakes.
Well, people often cite those cartoons as the best of the series, and I think it's because those are the ones where it does. It gets personal, and also it really kind of touches on the comic books in ways that these cartoons often did not. And the same holds true for a show like Batman Brave and the Bold, where people talk about Chill of the Night and that episode as being their favorite because it really gets into Batman's real life backstory. It deals with the Wayne family and deals with things on a personal nature that you generally would not get, because that's another show where, and it's a wonderful show, but that's the same show where the characters pretty much are who they are in costume, as opposed to, Bruce Wayne doesn't get much to do in Batman Brave and the Bold as opposed to what he got to do in, say, Batman the Animated Series.
Right. Yeah. Now, and I make the argument that that's last season, the one with the fear and such, and then the subsequent Ruby Spears Superman sort of show you the potential for doing more adult-geared superhero cartoons, so that then we do get to Batman the Animated Series, Justice League, and such like that. Because I think those are the precursors.
Well, keep in mind, though, that this is also where that's where the transition began to take place, because in these earlier episodes, that's why I was trying to kind of defining, it's not the first generation of American animation, but it is sort of still part of the first generation of American animation on television. Really the first, you're talking the early 60s with the Flintstones and some of those shows where animation was actually being created for television as opposed to being like Bugs Bunny reruns from the movie. The movie shorts became TV episodes. The shows like the Flintstones and other Saturday morning cartoons that began to develop in the 60s. I think it was the 60s. I don't think it began in the 50s. Because mostly a lot of the 50s stuff was live action stuff,
right.
Like Howdy Doody and what have you. But a lot of those producers and writers and, a lot of the stuff it was a combination, for example, if we go back to Filmation in the mid-60s, of people who were involved with DC Comics and other people who were writing those episodes. Here, it's not the same people, but you're getting a different take. By the 80s, a lot of the writers had these cartoons had been around for a while, and so a lot of the writers were now people who had been reading comics for a while, had been watching animation, and it was a different group of people who were getting into animation. So, for example, and I know we're getting kind of off point here, but the people who were involved in those cartoons, the late stage Super Friends and Ruby Spears, were people like Marv Wolfman, Alan Burnett. I mean, these are names that are familiar to comic book readers as people who had major, Marv Wolfman especially, had major impacts on comics and in making them more adult. Alan Burnett was one of the key players on Batman the Animated Series. So you're starting to see that shift in personnel in the 80s that eventually brought us to what we got in the 90s, which was really the golden age of Batman cartoons and what ended up becoming the whole Batman the Animated Series and Justice League Unlimited and all of that stuff, which is just absolutely glorious. But going back to these episodes, these were still kind of, I always imagine them, people at their, clacky clack clack at their typewriters chomping on cigars, like, the kids will love this.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, kids love dogs that can talk. Yeah, let's put that in there. I know every time I do that I sound like Stan Lee. I was never here. I'm Stan Lee. Enough said. But that's how I imagine all those guys like, the kids will love this. We can't have them punch. Well, we'll have them all be rescue people instead, and they'll go out and that's just kind of how I imagine the writers' room going for these things.
Right. Now, I got to ask, though, when he is Clark and he realizes he needs to follow the armored car with the money in it, and he starts to, make the move to remove the clothing, and then we cut to him flying, though. Did you hope, though, because I was disappointed, that he would have said this is a job for Superman?
Yeah, you always kind of hope for those little winks.
Right.
But yeah.
I mean, mind you, he will say it more than enough times in the run of the series, but just the first time he's there as Clark Kent, you kind of wished he'd just done it.
Sure. But it was nice. It was nice that he did have to, again, that transformation is always exciting.
Right, exactly, yeah. And not only do we get to see Clark Kent, but this is also the first appearance of Kryptonite.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's true. Yep.
yeah. Which then also leads me to that whole thing of filling in the gaps, because
A balloon floating free in the sky is seen by Superman. And in the balloon, something is covered by a blanket. But instead of Wendy and Marvin, he finds Kryptonite, that material from the planet of his origin, which robs him of his powers and weakens him dangerously. As the Kryptonite is tossed out of the balloon, its potent effect on Superman is diminished. And when it falls far enough away, it loses all effect, and Superman regains consciousness.
If they tricked me, then they tricked the others too.
and as it fell, I'm looking at it going, somebody picked it up. There's a Super Friends story for you someday.
Right. Well, that was always the funny thing about it. It always seemed that and I know that they, again, going back to the early 70s, right around this period, was in comics, they were trying to de-emphasize Kryptonite. It became such an easy plot device that everybody in the world could get their hands on Kryptonite, as if it was like the most, available thing for any street thug. Is the amount of Kryptonite was so widespread that it was easy enough to turn into a Kryptonite ray or a Kryptonite. They could build it into a Kryptonite box or Kryptonite this. It was like the easiest, most malleable, most available rare mineral that could be found on Earth. It must have, the market for Kryptonite, you would think it would be really, really expensive, but given how much of it was around, it must have been very cheap to acquire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I mentioned before, there's some moments there where they miss certain cues and take advantage then of Wendy and Marvin instead, and then basically drag the story to a halt. There's a point there where the Super Friends realize Wendy and Marvin are missing. Batman turns to Robin and says, go find them. And I thought, okay, we're going to get a scene where Robin's going to save them or something. But no, instead, it's this whole lengthy scene where in the end, Wonder Dog gets away to go alert the Super Friends and bring them, and nothing is ever said again about what, if anything, Robin did.
This is what I was saying when I was getting to at the top of our episode here, is that they had a real problem with pacing these episodes. Mm-hmm. I mean, for one thing, they went in with the idea that they needed to be 45-minute episodes or 50 minutes or whatever it is, which I got to tell you, again, unless it's a really, really great story for animation, I mean, it's so weird to me that they thought that was the way to keep kids' attention, was give them a really, really long episode for them to try. Kids getting up on Saturday morning are so hopped up on sugar cereal and bouncing off the couches. And I mean, the idea that they would actually sit and watch all the way through, and then these extended sequences that pad the episode of the three of them, Marvin, Wendy, and Wonder Dog, they just stop the episode cold. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't mean to be unkind. I just find that they were unnecessary, and I'm so glad that, again, the other big change that they made in later episodes that really worked was not just the personnel change, was by making episodes shorter.
Right.
Giving us multiple episodes in an hour, which works so much. And the thing is that they did that with Filmation. They knew that then, that they couldn't give kids, if you were going to give them the Superman Aquaman hour, you can't have 30-minute segments. You had to break them. The longer episodes had to be broken up in two, and then you had a shorter segment. And it's so much more effective in terms of storytelling and also just attention grabbing that like I said, I started fast forwarding through these segments because it's just, these are not characters that I want, and it just drags the story out. So it is part of the tough part to get through when you're watching these early episodes.
Right. Yeah. Now, just two other things I noted here in terms of the show. One, again, I know continuity is not king with any of these shows, not even just Super Friends, but any in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But we'd already established that Wonder Woman seemed to be able to leap great distances as she jumped in front of the waters and such. In the first episode, she falls into a pit. Yeah, they take the slide away, but she couldn't just jump out.
Yeah, I got to tell you, here's something that I've always been kind of confused by, has been Wonder Woman's powers anyway. Like, I know Aquaman's limitations. I know Batman and Robin's limitations. I know Superman's limitations. But even reading Wonder Woman in the comics and seeing her on television and in movies and in animation is that Wonder Woman's powers always seem to shift for me. Mm-hmm. Like, if she can fly, why does she need the invisible jet? That's number one. If she is she bulletproof? She's got the the bracelets that so I was like, but is she bulletproof, or can she be shot? Or I've never actually been entirely clear. So when you see her in these episodes, it's the same thing. It's sort of like, well, what exactly? We know she's really strong,
right?
And we know she's got the lasso of truth, which also, of course, works, for other, it also seems to grow at will. She could lasso gigantic boulders with it, and she can also tie up people with.
Right.
It always seems to be as long as she needs it to be. But it does seem to me that they shift Wonder Woman's powers from time to time based on the need of the story, because I don't know how, and I'm sure who Wonder Woman, listeners are sitting here thinking, no, Wonder Woman can only do this, that, and the other thing. But for whatever reason, I've never been entirely clear on what the limits of her powers are. So,
yeah, and for that matter, I got to ask, Aquaman. There's a scene there at the beginning when they're trying to discover what's going on with Baffles and such, and so he's under the water and he talks to the fish.
He talks to the fish.
Well, yeah, he talks to the fish. I get that, but do you think the fish are that smart that because he asks them, "Have you seen any unusual boat activity?" I feel like it's like Adam West walking in and going, "Have you seen any unusual people here?" It's like you're talking to fish, asking about boat trends.
Well, it is funny. Well, I mean, it's the implication being is that, yes, the fish would know this because fish are, I guess, they're smarter, or they have some way, since you can communicate with them, they're more sentient, or they're more intelligent. They're sentient, of course, but they're more intelligent than we give them credit for.
Right.
That struck me too, because that's always, of course, the great gag about Aquaman is that he's a superhero who talks to fish. And people make that out like it's a big joke and everything. And even the Aquaman movie makes light of that. And Justice League made light of that. Oh, you're the guy who talks to fish. And I'm thinking, first off, that's really cool power.
Yeah.
Second of all, they usually explain it in a way it's like, no, he can telepathically communicate, but he doesn't really talk to them. He can give them guidance. No, here he's just talking to fish.
Aquaman patrols beneath the river, which flows alongside the museum. Through telepathic communication with the marine life of the river, he asks about any unusual boat activity in the area, and is informed there has been none.
And I think it's hysterical. It's like he's investigating it underwater, and so he's using all of his underwater sources, and it's like, it is like Batman going into an alleyway and grabbing an informant. This time it's just under the sea, and he's going to this big, I don't even know what kind of fish it is, but he's going to this fish and asking him questions because I guess he assumes that the fish will know. And I just thought that was kind of neat.
Yeah.
Funny.
Yeah, no, funny, but it's weird. So the other thing, too, I just briefly, obviously, the main cast would often do voices for other characters. And in this case here, all the males take on the roles of the goons. And Frank Welker as well, handling it. And what's funny is that as the scene they're in, with the main thing where they're trying to capture the armored car in the tunnel and stuff, it's as the scene goes on, they lose their tough guy accents.
The armored car takes this road to the harbor. We'll follow it to this tunnel, and we pick up the pieces. Rudy, check the boys.
6-2 to 4-5. 6-2 to 4-5. Come in. Over. 6-2 to 4-5. Come in.
4-5 to 6-2. Go ahead.
How's it coming?
We're all set here.
Tell them to block the tunnel.
We spotted the armored car. Get moving.
Roger. Let's go.
Wonder Woman to Batman.
Go ahead, Wonder Woman.
There's some suspicious activity in the Wadsworth Tunnel.
Right, we'll investigate.
Where'd that car come from?
Arnie and Harv will block the tunnel. We'll come up behind them. And surprise, we own $5 million, Rudy.
Rudy, you'll be surprised, and who's going to be surprised?
Okay, let's get out of here. It's Batman.
How on earth did you recognize me? Now let's go into the tunnel and see what you chaps have been up to.
We can't do that, Batman.
Why not?
That armored car will come barreling through here any second.
We better get out of here. Hold on.
Let him go, Robin. We evidently don't have much time. Come on.
Yeah, they're, for as good as they are on the main characters themselves, and we've said this before in different contexts, but Olan Soule as Batman is brilliant. He really is, other than Kevin Conroy, to me, he's the second best Batman animated voice. He captures that Silver Age Batman, Silver Age, Bronze Age Batman. He's got that really good Bruce Wayne / Batman voice of that period.
Right.
Casey Kasem is the best Robin voice ever in animation. And the funny thing was that by the time Super Friends rolled around, he was, when he did Filmation, I think he was 36 years old. So we're talking, this is 5 years later. So he's already in his 40s when he was doing Robin. And yet he still sounded like a teenager. He was great at it. But at the same time, they're not quite as good when they're doing those other voices. They don't disguise their voices well. You can hear it, and it definitely lends that cheap air to the episodes because you don't have all of those other voice actors who come in to do the other voices. So you could always hear Casey Kasem, and you could always hear Olan Soule or Danny Dark or whoever doing those other voices. And sometimes it works, and you think to yourself, wait a minute, I don't recognize that voice. And then you hear it, and they're like, okay, it's Olan Soule, and then he did a decent job. But for the most part, yeah, they'll start out talking like thugs, and then they'll lapse into their own voices. So I guess that's a problem that the director, the voice director had at the time.
Right, yeah. Now, what about you? Anything else that stood out?
No, just, these are sweet episodes. And again, it's always the case where they are more rescue and patrol characters as opposed to beating villains up and what have you, and for the little bit of lifting the veil. When I watched this episode, we're recording this at a time when we were also preparing to record our final episodes on our Filmation Batman run on the Batcave podcast, and so I watched the last two episodes of that. Rewatched those the same evening that I watched this Super Friends episode. And the distinction between the two within 5 years is really, really great, actually. And the difference between how the two different houses approached the storytelling, which you can tell that by the late 60s, they were still, even by today's standards, the violence is not violent, but it was much more upfront, where Batman, they're using terms like, I want to kill them, Batman and Robin, they'll be dead. That this should finish them off, and Joker trying to blow up trucks, and it's legit mayhem. Versus this, which is always about rescue missions and trying to teach lessons and what have you. And it was because of that shift from the animation houses and the pressures they were feeling from the public about toning down the violence on children's cartoons. And Lou Scheimer, in his book, talked about this a great deal, the pressures that they were under. And that's why you really did see a shift in tone, both in terms of Hanna-Barbera and Filmation, from what they were doing in the 60s versus what they were doing in the 70s. So in watching a Super Friends episode back-to-back with some of these Filmation episodes, that really, really becomes clear. So if I have anything to note, it's in that context when you really do see the difference in tone between the two series. And still, I prefer the Filmation. It's not like that I'm a bloodthirsty fiend wanting to see violence. But the one thing that those episodes had, the Filmation episodes had over the Super Friends episodes, and frankly, it worked better. The reason why Legion of Doom worked better is that you don't have the conflict in these early episodes that really make a good story, and that's why they're not as compelling. The conflicts aren't strong enough, and that's one of the things that still was hammering home for me as I watched this.
All right, then. So let me ask you this. If we apply our 5 Starfield pattern to this, how many stars would you give it?
Same thing. I give it a 2. I mean, I'm grading these episodes on a kind of a harsh scale because I know what's coming. And if I'm grading it on the look, if I'm grading it compared to the first episode, it's a better episode, which I think I give the first one a two stars.
Right, you did.
Yeah, but if I look at these episodes, I can't help but look at them against what I know is coming for Super Friends and how much the show improves over time.
Okay, that's fair. I'm going to go 3 because it is a little better. I would almost call this, because you figure 3 is middle of the road. This is an average Super Friends episode. There's a fair share of adventure. There's a fair share of decent animation and such. Yes, it's also marred by Wendy and Marvin with their scenes and such. But in the grand scheme of things, like you say, what's coming along, but those will be 4s and 5s, whereas I seriously doubt, I could be wrong, I seriously doubt we're going to see anything in the first season with a 4 or 5. Who knows? I could be surprised.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I'm just taking these as they go. Again, I don't mean to knock them too harshly. This was my concern going into doing this podcast.
Right.
I don't want to make sure that I don't want to come off as being a Grinch where these episodes are concerned. But it's particularly the early ones in the season, it took them a little while for them to get their sea legs. Right, exactly. But you know what? We said the same thing with Filmation. That is true. And for any of our listeners here, you should check out the final episodes of our Filmation run on the Batcave podcast, because the show finished up really, really strongly. It did. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so as we wrap things up here, Dan, how's things going over at 13th Dimension? Yeah, the same. We've got anybody who listens to these podcasts, I feel confident in saying that they'll enjoy what we've got going on at 13th Dimension. We do a lot of, everything we do is with the eye of yesterday and today. So there's a lot of material on there that looks at comic books and television and movies from the 60s, 70s, 80s, as well as what's going on now and reflecting that. So, come check us out and, stay for a while. And again, we'll be back with another one of these episodes as well. And you can check all that out over at 13th Dimension. That's 13thdimension.com. Yep, and you can also follow us on Twitter and check us out on Facebook. We're pretty active in both places. Very cool. So, folks, that's going to do it then for this episode of the World's Greatest Super Friends podcast. Tune in next time, where we're going to be taking a look at Professor Goodfellow's Geek. As the world... I know, I saw that too. I know. That was great. The world basically allows itself to be controlled by a computer, but then the computer gets its own ideas. Yes. What could possibly go wrong? Exactly. It's basically Super Friends versus Hal. Super Friends versus Hal. Super Friends versus, what was it? The Foreman Project. Super Friends versus the Alex 7000 from the Bionic Woman. Yeah. Superman versus Nomad from Star Trek. Yes. Or Super Friends versus Nomad from Star Trek. I mean, you name it. Yeah. Or did the computer in Superman 3 have a name? Yes. I forget the name of it, though, off the top of my head. God, I blanked that movie out. Because I'm one of the rare people who actually think Superman 3 is worse than Superman 4. I can actually watch Superman 4. Wow. I think Superman 3 is unwatchable. Superman 4, I can at least tolerate. And I know that sounds weird, but it's true. Wow. Man. See, now that in itself is a whole podcast. Sure is. Maybe we ought to do that as a sidetrack one of these days. But I firmly believe that Superman 3 is worse than Superman 4. Wow. Yeah. All right. Well, there you go, folks. Stay tuned. We'll have that along at some point here. Something you didn't know. Yeah. So, folks, until next time, thank you so much for listening. Once again, Dan, everyone, take care. Thanks, John.